Frydl.
Thank you. Thank Michelle. I want to begin by thanking Michelle Sellers, the MLK Library, and the staff of the Washingtoniana Room especially. I want to thank Maurice Jackson, who is not here, and William Branch, who I hope is here. Everybody has an explanation for why we have a drug war. Some agree with the reasoning that the government offers every day in multiple ways. We have a drug war because of drug use. Neither I nor any scholar I know of will argue that the drug war incarcerates substantial numbers of sober teetotalers with no involvement in the drug trade. Obviously, the drug war is in some way tied to drug use. But one need only a pair of eyes to see that there are tremendous discrepancies between who is in jail and who is feeling the brunt of the drug war versus the numbers and diversity of those engaged in illicit drug use. If white suburban teenagers snorting cocaine filled our jails, the government's explanation would have more credibility. In attempting to account for the origins of the drug war, then, we are in effect attempting to explain this discrepancy. If we find the government's explanation to be woefully incomplete, then the story of how and why the drug war came about would restore what is missing. In my book, I argue that the drug war's particular shape, its scope, and its function resulted from certain dilemmas of governance in an age of vastly expanding state power. This story is impossible to tell without the District of Columbia. Tonight, I will focus largely on the one-way street, that is, the imposition that the federal government made on Washington, D.C. But I want to make it clear that, in reality and in my book, there is much more pushback and activism within the city. Even at its most politically impotent stage, residents challenged the federal government's plans for it by failing to comply, by insisting on home rule, and by offering a different account or explanation of events than the government's version. But this evening I will focus on the ways the federal government used the district to craft the modern drug war. First, let me give some sense of existing scholarship on the origins of the drug war and where my own work fits in with that literature. Most scholars who have looked at this issue emphasize two things. First, the classification of certain drugs as narcotics, heroin, morphine, cocaine, and later marijuana. And second, their removal from general circulation, all of which took place in the early part of the 20th century and was deeply tied to the reputation these drugs had acquired for recreational use among racial minorities. In my own work, I try to emphasize the many steps between these events and the regime of punishment and prohibition erected in the early 1970s that provides the legislative and institutional basis for the modern drug war. I think it is important to look at this interval of time because to say something cannot circulate freely is not the same as saying it is criminally prohibited. For a period between post-World War I and 1970, these drugs were used as medicines, and various countries had different regulatory approaches to handle them. In the United States, the Harrison Narcotic Act of 1914 used tariffs and taxes to track and regulate opiate production, importation, and dispensation down to the fraction of the gram, as one official boasted. After international controls were put in place in the 1930s, illicit users were supplied not only by diversion from licit channels of drug production, but also from subversion, the clandestine production and sale of drugs in knowing violation of the law. As the heroin market went underground, the U.S. government chased it with a vigor and moralizing spirit embodied in the country's first commissioner of the U.S. Narcotics Bureau, Harry Anslinger. A fixture in Republican circles, Anslinger was known for his scolding tirades and sensationalized depictions of illicit drug traffic and use. Over the course of his long service from 1930 to 1961, the commissioner nominated different racial stereotypes, depending upon the setting and the situation, as the culprit behind narcotics traffic, variously designating Asian, African American, Latino, or Italian ethnics as the guiding force behind the narcotics conspiracy. Echoing other witch hunts popular in his day, Anslinger's script was familiar, but his tactics and targets changed over time. Before World War I, the commissioner spent much of his time and energy facing off against doctors, challenging their professional authority and integrity in an attempt to stymie the flow of narcotics diverted from their offices. After the war, Anslinger continued to send his agents to check up on medical narcotic prescriptions throughout the 1950s, but a bureaucratic review found that he devoted only 20% of his manpower to doing so. The rest pursued illicit deals supplied through subversion. As he turned his attention and resources to the underground market, Anslinger clamored for more severe penalties for the possession of opiates without the appropriate tax stamp. And members of Congress, especially members of the powerful Southern delegation, were quick to oblige, but only on the assurance that certain kinds of drug deals would be subject to Anslinger's aggressive tactics and not others. Thus began a collaborative relationship between the Bureau of Narcotics and Congress that was intended to construct, enhance, but also to delimit the boundaries of the nation's drug war. Southerners who were well aware of their own local problems with narcotic diversion received assurances from Anslinger that, in fact, illicit use was limited to the major cities, with little of it in small cities and rural areas. As the commissioner mapped the geography of his intentions, the district became the special focus of his efforts. In my book, I pay special attention to Washington, D.C., because I am obliged to. Throughout the 20th century, the U.S. Congress tested the tactics of the drug war in D.C., drafting legislation, shaping the evolution of policing, and invoking the racially charged specter of drug-induced criminality in the city to help justify the modern drug war. More than anything else, this was a consequence of the district's lack of political autonomy. The Constitution of the United States grants the Congress exclusive jurisdiction over Washington, and for most of its history, the city has had little say in the conduct of its business. Between 1800 and 1964, D.C. residents could not even vote for president. Since Reconstruction, D.C. was governed by a board of commissioners appointed by the president, which served in coordination with the congressional committee from each chamber assigned to oversee district affairs. As a result, what would in other places be considered a state crime was in D.C. a federal offense. Felony cases were heard before a federal court and were prosecuted by a U.S. attorney appointed to the district. Deprived of basic electoral rights, district residents lived according to laws that they had no ability to make or to change. D.C.'s powerlessness took on greater significance when the city became among the first in the Northeast Corridor to approach majority black status by the late 1950s. Southern congressmen made a concerted effort to depict these demographic changes in a menacing light, offering a view of the district as under siege by black criminals who went unchallenged as the forces supporting segregation and social control slackened. Because of this and other similar remarks, many scholars of the drug war assume that the link between prohibition and punishment and race was discursive, coded into law and order rhetoric designed to appeal to white ethnics who could be enticed from the Democratic fold. Although valid, this argument nevertheless neglects the obvious. That is, that the link between the drug war and race was explicit, even mechanical, and it was initially forged in a symbiotic fashion between the congressional committees devoted to oversight of the District of Columbia and those dedicated to the regulation of narcotics. The first and still most significant example of this special relationship was the enactment of mandatory minimum sentencing for drug offenses in the 1950s. When it was first proposed, the idea was a startling departure from common practice. Mandatory minimums ran contrary to common law and its celebrated tradition of judicial autonomy. In the place of judicial discretion, James Davis, the district subcommittee chairman from Georgia, proposed in 1953 that mandatory minimum sentences be attached to a series of offenses that would require a presiding judge to give a predetermined sentence no matter what the judge happened to think. Davis drew heavily on his views of the district to justify the move. We've reached the point where it is risky for women and girls to be on the streets after dusk, Congressman Davis concluded, at a time when D.C.'s crime rate was one of the lowest of any major city in the country. Despite the crime panic, some congressmen voiced reservations and urged caution. Pennsylvania Democrat Herman Eberharter, the most outspoken critic of the bill, pointed out that Congress was proposing something to the residents of District of Columbia that is not required in any state of the Union, adding, "We are attempting, in effect, to use the District of Columbia as a guinea pig on which to try out a radical departure of Newport